you go. Tammy's got her slides. So, um, without further ado, let me introduce Tammy. Tammy Gregersen received her Master's in Education and PhD in Linguistics in Chile, where she also began her academic career. She's currently teaching and researching at the American University of Sharjah, where she also coordinates their Masters in TESOL program. She's co-authored or co-edited several books, with three more in press, on topics such as individual differences, nonverbal communication, positive psychology in the language classroom, and language teacher education. She's particularly excited about the publication of an upcoming book with Oxford University Press that she is co-authoring with Sarah Mercer from the University of Graz on language teacher well-being. She's also published extensively in reputable international peer-reviewed journals and applied linguistics anthologies on similar topics. Tammy has presented at conferences and taught in graduate programs across the globe, which deems an incredible privilege because it taps into her passions for traveling and exploring new cultures. Everybody, please give Tammy a warm welcome in the chat window. I'll turn off my sound and video now. Over to you, Tammy. Okay, Tammy, you may need to turn on your sound using the microphone button at the top of your screen.
Here we are. Okay. Thank you so much for the warm welcome in the chat box. I am thrilled to be here, and I can't wait to share with you some things that I have been so passionate about. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Feliz trasnochando. That's Spanish for happy passing the night if it's 3 o'clock in the morning for you. But here in beautiful UAE, the United Arab Emirates, it's about 25 degrees Celsius. The sun is out, and I've had my morning coffee, so I'm really ready to go. Ciao, ciao, ciao. Buenos dias. So today, everybody, I am going to be working from what a group of Oxford expert panelists have put together on global skills. And it is something that I'm super passionate about. I'm going to be working on 3 specific areas. It's going to be on citizenship, intercultural competence, and well-being, and how we can actually weave all of this into our language teaching. So now, this is probably not going to be the whole idea of interweaving these skills is probably not going to be a new thing for many of us. But first of all, I'd like to say that as language teachers, and first of all, I feel a super strong kindredship for everybody who's on here today. Because if you're a language teacher, there's 2 things that bind us together, and that's language and that's teaching. And we have the ability to make a huge impact on the whole world. And so, first of all, we are in a privileged position because we can open up learners to new ideas, instill important human values. And in the end, we have a huge impact on the future because our learners are the future of the world. So, you know what? I'm just thrilled to be here and be with all of you because it makes me very proud to be a language teacher. And secondly, we have a lot of us, I'm thinking most of us are English teachers, which means that we're teaching a language that will open up a whole new global world to a lot of our learners. So we are indeed in a privileged position, guys. So the next, I'm used to this, my mouse. Okay, so I mentioned that this probably wasn't a real new thing for a lot of people, the fact that we interweave our linguistic goals with something else. For example, this is a little bit of a poll that I have here, and I want you to ask yourself the question, when was the last time, or when did you, or have you ever weaved the whole idea of non-linguistic goals with language goals? For example, some of you might be content-based teachers, or what Europeans call CLIL, when you used your non-linguistic goal, which was academic content, to teach English. Or how about maybe the second option, where you gave your learners a task and they needed to use English to complete the task? Or maybe you were very interested in developing processes of cooperative learning and teamwork and really to build rapport within your learners, and you wanted to use English as a means to build teamwork. You see? So I'm looking at that poll and I am really impressed with the fact that well over half of you have used academic content. Well over half of you have used English to complete a task, and a third of you have used English to develop teamwork. So that means to me that we have in our group today a lot of people who have been using English as a means to do something else. So we start already from a very strong knowledge base, okay? Now, as I mentioned before, I'm going to be asking you to weave the non-linguistic goals of citizenship, intercultural competence, and emotional self-regulation into your language teaching. I'm going to give you some theoretical framework, but I'm also going to give you some very hands-on practical teaching tips. Okay, here we go. Let's start then with the whole idea of citizenship. The Global Skills Expert Panel, they produced a, well, I'm back to square number one. I'm going to have to move here. The Global Skills Expert Panel gave us this following definition of citizenship. They said that social responsibility, both locally and globally, is at the heart of citizenship, inextricably intertwined with advocating for the elimination of discrimination and respect for diversity. It also encompasses sustainable living practices. Now you're looking at that and you're saying, oh no, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to give you some very practical examples. One of the coolest examples comes from the United Nations, and it's going to be, I'm going to show you this first. It's the United Nations created a whole list of 17 sustainable goals. Now, look, what is so cool about this webinar is that I think that there are people from every single continent of the world, maybe not Antarctica, but we are a meeting of people coming together from all over the world, and it is so cool. And you know what? Every single one of these 17 goals that came from the United Nations, every single nation on the world has a representative in the United Nations. All of these 17 things are important to all of us, every single one of us. Now, this doesn't show it as well as my next list, which are these. What you saw on the previous slide, this is a clearer list. And I don't want to bore you, but I want to go over this list of sustainability goals because I want each and every one of you to think, does this matter to me, where I live, and to the future of my students? Number one, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, reducing inequality, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and then partnerships for goals. Now, you know what, guys? These are, when we talk about citizenship, this is a fantastic place for us to start. And you might think, well, how do I even begin? First of all, if you want more information on these sustainability goals and what the United Nations are doing, please, by all means, Google UN sustainability goals. You'll get to the UN and they'll give you more information. But for our purposes today about language learning, let's take a look. You know what? If you go to any language learning series that you have, I hope it's an Oxford University Press one, right, guys? Right? But any EFL texts that you see, they're going to bring you through certain units. Who doesn't have a food unit, right? Well, how about during your food unit, why not talk about good health and well-being? You know what? If you've got a food unit, it's easy to bring in nutrition. It's easy to bring in balanced diets, right? And the opposite of having food is hunger. So it's easy to talk about goals of trying to eliminate hunger across the world. We all have job units, right? Why not bring up gender equality, which is goal number 5 in the UN? You know what? Why don't we have pictures of men as nurses and women as lawyers, right? How about when we talk about the weather, right? Why can't we talk about climate action? We talk about it being rainy or cloudy, but we can also talk about what we need to do to keep the planet healthy. We all have animal units. Why not consider life below water and life on land, the goals number 14 and number 15? I noticed that when I was watching the introduction to my presentation, that Oxford has even created links to their graded readers on some of these issues. That is just a cool initiative that Oxford's been taking care of. If we do a school unit, why not take a look at quality education, which is goal number 4? And then, of course, in the transportation unit, why not talk about activities on affordable and clean energy, right? We might talk about a car, but let's talk about a car that uses gas, a car that uses electricity, a car that's a hybrid. All of these things are really important things that we can bring into our normal discussions of what we actually do. Okay, now, what I've done is I went online, okay, and I found a specific example from the British Council. And what I did was I took a look at what they were doing in terms of presenting something on climate change. So I used a specific one. And what they did was they took the reading on climate change and they created language goals to go with it. So they created goals on dictionary skills, on pronunciation, on specialized vocabulary, and then how to recognize all of this outside the classroom. So take a look at their specific goals. I lifted this from their lesson plan. Really cool here. So they had this reading, right, on climate change. And then they created these elements. So the green one is a non-linguistic goal, which is a global skill, the global skill of citizenry. And this was theirs. Students will understand important causes of environmental problems and some solutions. And then along with that non-linguistic goal, they were weaving in these linguistic goals. Extend their understanding of vocabulary connected to climate and environment. Improve the understanding of pronunciation information given in a dictionary. So they obviously created some dictionary activities. Take notes and retell information to others. We can do that with any kind of reading that we bring in. And then use expressions of certainty when discussing events likely to happen in the future. Now that came along with specific questions that came along in the lesson that they were asking their learners to do on this reading about climate change. Now, what I wanted to do here was just to show you that you can take a reading on any kind of global skill and create your own linguistic opportunities around that. Okay? So, what you have then is a dual stranded, oops, you have a dual, sorry about that, my cat just came in and knocked over my stuff. You have a dual strand approach to the objectives, right? So you saw in those previous objectives that the red was in where the language objectives and the green were in the linguistic or language objectives. Now, I just kind of need to draw your attention. I'm a teacher trainer, right? That's what I do, what I'm really passionate about. So I do need to bring in best practices here. Best practices mean when you go to do assessment, whether it's formal, informal, summative, formative, you need to hit all of your objectives, right? You need to assess over all of your objectives. So make sure that you're paying as much attention to assessing your non-linguistic objective as you did your linguistic objectives, right? So just kind of putting that in there for you, okay? So next, I'm going to move on to the next big global skill. So we just covered the global skill of citizenry and how we can interweave citizenship goals into language teaching. I gave you a specific example, okay? Now we have the idea of intercultural competence. And the global skills people on the expert panel from the global skills, they define this as the ability to maneuver cultural differences peacefully and imaginatively in a survival, that this is a survival issue in a flourishing global world, and one that language learners in particular must manage. Interestingly, being interculturally competent is intimately related to one's emotional regulation. Okay, now here we are again. It seems like kind of a complicated definition because there's a lot of things involved. But what's important here is that they're doing three things. Number one, they're saying that intercultural competence is a no-brainer for language learning. It's inherent in the process. You have to be interculturally competent because you're crossing borders. Number two, that intercultural competence is a global issue. And number three, that it's also related to emotional regulation, which is going to be our third topic. So really, even though number two, not number one, number two, intercultural competence is a standalone issue for us right now in this moment, I will be connecting it very tightly to what later comes as emotional regulation. Okay, here we go. Now, self-regulation, what is it? It's the ability to look inward, recognize, and deal with one's own emotion. There's a couple things here, guys, okay? There's number one, it's awareness, the ability to look in. Number two, it's recognition. It means identifying our emotions. And number three, it's management, dealing with our own emotions, okay? Now, intercultural competence takes that one step further because it's not only identifying our own, but being able to identify and work with the emotions of others, okay? Now, as I mentioned, learning an additional language means communicating across cultural boundaries, and it means that there's a complex exchange of feelings, emotions, information, and ideas, right? So learning an additional language inherently means these other two things. Now, you might think that this is really kind of a weird thing that I'm going to do because I am an applied linguist, and all of us are language teachers. And so it might be weird that I'm going to move beyond language for a minute, because I think it's really important that sometimes as language teachers, we forget that language is actually embedded in a communication process. It's not just verbal. That's what's crazy about this, guys. Now I have my cat here. He knocked something over, and I need this up here. I'm going to actually tell you a really cool story that sets the stage for what I want to do here. Okay, here we go. Here's a cool story. It's about this dog. Okay, and this is actually a story that's coming from Japan. Are you ready for a story? Here we go. Long ago, in a small, faraway village, there was this place known as the House of 1,000 Mirrors. There was a small, happy little dog, and he learned of this place, and he decided to visit it. When he arrived, he bounced happily up the stairs, and he got into the doorway. He looked through the doorway, and with his ears lifted high and his tail wagging as fast as he could, he looked in the mirror. And to his great surprise, he found himself staring at 1,000 other little happy dogs, all wagging their tails just as fast as his. He smiled with a great smile and was answered by 1,000 great smiles, just as warm and friendly as his. As he left the house, he thought to himself, "This is a wonderful place. I'm going to come back and visit it often." Now, in this same village, another little dog, who was not, let's say, quite as happy as this first one, he decided also to visit this house. He slowly climbed up the stairs. He looked into the door. And guess what? When he saw the 1,000 unfriendly-looking dogs staring back at him, he growled and was horrified to see 1,000 little dogs growling right back. And he thought to himself, "That is a horrible place. I will never go back there again." Well, there you have it. So, there's more than just the verbal channel. Okay? So I want to talk to you, it's a little bit about emotional contagion. Here's a little bit about emotional contagion. When we communicate our language, which is the verbal or linguistic channel of communication, we're using spoken words. But along with those spoken words, guys, is the paraverbal or the paralinguistic. Some of you linguistics type people might have understood the word suprasegmental. But what this means when I say paraverbal, it's how we say something, how we use our voices. So for example, I could say yes, Or I could say, yes. The way I said that has an impact on the meaning of what I'm saying. I'm saying the word yes, but yes and yes have two different meanings. So now we've got the verbal, we've got the paraverbal, but we also have the nonverbal. I could say yes, yes, or I could go, right? It all means the same thing. I hope you were looking at me. Are you looking at me? I could go, right? So now what we've got going here, guys, is we've got three channels all going towards communication. Only one of them is actually language related. Now, there's a method to my madness here, why I'm talking about this, because I'm going to show you that when we're talking about things like intercultural communication and later emotional self-regulation, the primary channel for communicating our emotion is not words. And sometimes what we say and how we say it are in conflict. For example, I'm not angry. Okay, right? What are you going to believe? Are you going to believe that I'm really not angry? I doubt it. Because actually research suggests that people will believe your nonverbal cues before they believe your words. Now, the verbal message, what we actually say, the words we say, that carries our content or our cognitive load. What we say with words is the information. What we do non-verbally with our voices and with our bodies, that carries the relational or the emotional load of what we're doing. Okay, now when I talk to you about that disjoint between how we say something and what we say, and the fact that we believe more what people say non-verbally, is the fact that with a non-verbal message, with the way we communicate our emotion, those messages, the non-verbal and the paraverbal, tend to be instinctive and spontaneous. That means they're more difficult to control. That also means that people give to them, they honor them with greater authenticity, and they believe that they're less deceptive. Okay? So now, getting that kind of basic idea of what is the role of verbal, nonverbal, and paraverbal in the whole communicative context, let's take a look at what nonverbal codes there possibly could be. Because remember, all of these codes are working together to create an emotional understanding. So, facial expression, what we do with our face; gesture, what we do with our hands; gaze, what we're doing with our eyes, right? Posture, what we're doing with our bodies, right? Are we sitting up straight? Are we slouching? Are we sitting, right? Touch, scientists call this haptics. When we're talking to a student, do we reach out and touch them as we're speaking? When we're congratulating a colleague, do we pat them on the shoulder? Proxemics is actually, for us lay people, called the use of space. When we're talking to somebody, how far away are we speaking from them? Chronemics is how we're using time. Yeah, that's a very cultural issue. Do we show up 10 minutes early? My father used to say, if you're not 10 minutes early, you're late. I lived in Latin America for 17 years in Chile, so I was often standing there by myself for an hour because it was 10 minutes early plus the 45 minutes for everyone else to get there. Loved it. And then appearance. You may have seen my picture in this little window up there before you even heard me speaking. And I'll tell you, I know. Don't tell me it's not true. You made certain initial impressions. I made an initial impression on you, whether you think so or not. You looked at me and you sized me up without me even opening my mouth. And don't tell me you didn't, because you did. You may not have done it with consciousness, but you did do it. And that's okay. We all do it. So now, these are nonverbal codes. So in what we're going to do in the next activity, what I want to show you can do with your learners, is that number one, the face tends to convey the emotion that we're feeling. So my face, you're going to see through my face what emotion I'm feeling. And right now it's happy, right? It's happy. Now, interestingly enough, our posture will tell you the intensity with which I'm feeling that emotion. So my face will tell you I'm happy, but my posture will tell you how happy I really am. Okay? So it's kind of a cool thing. You know, once you start taking a look at this, you become a pretty good at reading people's body language. So, what can language teachers do with this? So I'm telling you all of this information, so now what? Now I'm going to give you some ideas of how to align your language goals with global skill objectives in intercultural competence and emotional regulation. So, according to Darwin. Now, this is funny because there's going to be kind of like what you might think is a little bit of a disconnect, because you're going to say, well, how can emotions be universally understood, but at the same time have cultural constraints? That's what I'm going to tell you. Darwin, way back in the 1800s, Charles Darwin, he came up with the idea that there are 6 emotions that everybody across the planet universally communicate in the same way. They're fear, anger, happiness, sadness, disgust, and surprise. So now you might say to yourself, oh, I'm not really sure. Look, there were 2 really cool experiments that I read recently that really kind of convinced me. There's a guy, Matsumoto is his last name. He's a Japanese researcher who works in California now. And he had the privilege of going to the Paralympics and the Olympics. And he videotaped and photographed sighted athletes, people who could see, and blind athletes, but blind from birth, okay? And he took pictures of them and videotaped them crossing the finish line. And then he compared their facial expression. And wouldn't you know what the crazy thing is, that people who were blind from birth, who could never have learned facial expressions, because how would they ever have seen anyone else's face ever in their lives? They had the exact same facial expressions as the sighted athletes did in crossing the finish line. They were happy when they won, and they were sad when they lost. Isn't that just crazy? And then there were other people who were anthropologists who had gone into people groups that had never had access to outside populations. And when they smiled and showed happiness, they made themselves understood with the people groups that they were now encountering. When they were sad and they showed tears or frustration, they understood one another, never having had contact with the outside world. And so these kinds of things are really fascinating. So you might say, well, I question the universality of emotion. And you know what? That's okay to have an okay degree of cynicism. But the fact is that let's just take it from the researcher's perspective that there are these emotions. Okay? But now let's move ahead to another little thing here. While there are universal expressions of certain emotions, there are also culture-specific frameworks or norms that generally tend to guide our behavior about how we can use emotion. For example, the circumstances that elicit emotions are going to somewhat change from culture to culture. The consequences that follow the expression of certain emotions are going to change from culture to culture. And the learned display rules, and that's what I'm going to talk about next, that govern facial behavior are going to differ from culture to culture. Okay, so now, if we're going to create in our learners a stronger degree of cultural competence, they need to know what are the display rules of different cultures in order for them to govern their facial behavior, or to understand the opposite culture. Let's take a look at this. I want you to take a look at these 2 pictures down here, okay? Display rules, like I mentioned, these are learned very early, and they become automatic, and they're bound with our cultures. These aren't things that you just one morning wake up and say, oh, I need to mask my sadness and not cry when somebody calls me a name. No, your culture will tell you from a very early age that this is what your culture demands of you. And you probably are very unaware of these because a lot of us haven't sat down and thought consciously, when do I cry? When do I not cry? When do I laugh and when do I not laugh? You know, I had some, when I was in the United States teaching at the University of Northern Iowa, I had a lot of international students. And we often talked about this. For example, laughter. I had some, I think she was from Japan. And she said that she had a tendency to laugh when she was embarrassed, right? And so that laughter oftentimes put her in a difficult position because that was what she was taught to do when she was embarrassed. But other people in the United States said, she's laughing at that, that's not funny. Right, so there's these cultural cues that separate that make cultures one distinct from another. Now look at these two pictures on the bottom. You've got the one on the left, males of a high status. That's Prince Charles and his two sons when they were younger. And the woman on the right is a British citizen who's a woman. So you see that both of these are in response to the same event. They were a response to the death of Princess Diana. But the people on the left had learned the display rules that in public, men of their social role do not cry. But the woman on the right, she knows that she can just let it all out because she's a woman and it's allowed within the context of laying flowers in front of the royal palace. So there you have display rules that are actually in action there. So now, let's talk about these common facial management techniques, and then I'm going to give you a really fun activity that you can do with your learners. Okay, so you can mask your emotions. And that means you stifle what you feel. You're the faker. That's what I call the faker. You can intensify your emotion, like you exaggerate what you feel, and I call that the drama queen. You can neutralize what you feel, and and that's eliminating what you feel, and we'll call that the poker face. And then you can actually de-intensify, which means minimize what you feel, and I'll call that the quasi-histoic, okay? We all do these things at one time or another, and our cultures dictate what's allowed, okay? So now, look at this cool activity. Okay, attach one of the techniques, one of these facial techniques that whether you're the poker face or the drama queen or whatever, you make these cartels, these little things out, and you write it and you put it on the back of each learner. You mix them all up. And then you have the learners mingle around and you call out a topic that you want them to talk about. And I'm hoping that you call out a topic that you want them to talk about that you've been using in class, use the vocabulary you've been using in class. And hopefully you can think about topics that might elicit strong feelings. Now, they walk around and they find a partner and they look at what the management technique is on their partner, and they have to answer with the facial display technique on their partner's back, okay? And then when that's done, they move to the next one and they do this 4 times. And so 4 times they're going to get a different topic of conversation and they're going to have to use a different technique for the emotion that they're going to be expressing. And then after this, the cool thing is, let's find out how good your learners are at decoding. Because until this moment, they're encoding the emotions, right? They have to encode the emotion because they're looking at the other person's facial management techniques and then encoding an emotion. Now at the end, you're asking them to decode the emotion because you're asking them to actually say, what is the facial management technique that's on my back? What were they using when they were speaking to me? Isn't that fun? Yeah, so in the debriefing, how did it feel when others talked to them? I mean, have a conversation with the students. Did students assigned to mask feel differently than those who were instructed to neutralize? Were some learners better at managing their facial expression of emotion? How difficult was it? And then finally, how important is it to understand the display rules of the people they communicate with? Yeah, right? Right? Okay, now, I'm moving on to my last topic, which is emotional self-regulation. Now, I don't want you to think that paying attention to these things, these global skills, is actually going to take time away or is actually going to do any detriment to your learners. In fact, even no harm is going to be superseded, because what happens is research say that what happens when learners focus on learners' socio-emotional well-being, when you look at the learner as a whole person, you enhance learning in traditional subjects and academic achievement, and you promote positive capabilities in the future workplace. Okay, that's research. And I'm actually, in the next slide, going to give you people you can actually look at. These people on the bottom of the screen, they'll all put their hands in the fire and say, when we interweave well-being goals in our language teaching, we actually improve learning. Now, I'm using emotional self-regulation as one idea under the bigger umbrella of well-being, okay? So now, woohoo! I'm going to show you 4 cool activities, and I've only got about 7 minutes before I take questions. So I'm going to try and get 4 activities into these 7 minutes. The first one is working with learners' signature strengths. I'm going to give you some background. This is coming from the subdiscipline of positive psychology. Positive psychology, the #1 goal is to balance what are the adverse ideas we study in psychology. Whenever we talk about psychology, what do we hear about? Neurosis, psychosis, schizophrenia. Everybody's got some kind of mental illness. And that's very true. I mean, I'm sorry, it's true that mental illness is something that we need to study, but that's only half of the equation. Because the other half of the equation is that there are so many people in the world who are okay and who need to be working on enhancing their well-being, right? So positive psychologists take the perspective of let's balance the research agenda and take a look not only at life's adversities, but also at what makes life worth living, okay? So that's where I'm going to be coming at you for the next 4 activities. I'm going to ask you to take a look at your learners and have them take a look at, isn't life an amazing phenomena, and can't I make it even better? So now, the #1 thing I'm talking about here is working with learners' signature strengths. These guys, Peterson, Seligman, and another guy, Csikszentmihalyi, who's the flow guy, if you've ever heard of this idea of flow. These 3 guys went all over the world to many different cultures, hundreds of different cultures, interviewed thousands of different people, and came up with 24 virtues that every culture around the world values. Now, of course, different cultures will value it to different degrees, okay? I'm not going to say that we all value the same things to the same degree, but to some degree, all 24 of the strengths that I'm showing you right now are valued. And these 24 strengths are fit into 6 broad categories, okay? What are they? They're things like appreciating beauty, bravery, creativity, curiosity, fairness, gratitude, humor, kindness, learning, love, perspective, spirituality, teamwork, and zest. Okay, so we're looking at all of these ideas here of signature strengths. And the cool thing is that, wait, at the end, I've got a slide, and on that end slide, there's a link. It's a website that will take you to this website where there's a free survey that will actually put in a hierarchical form your first to your 24th strength by taking this survey. It's free. Now, I'll tell you, my top strength is zest. I get a little over enthusiastic about things. And my worst, which people who know me understand it very well, my worst is prudence. I don't exemplify a lot of prudence. I'm kind of spontaneous. But anyway, what happens then is that you can get this, you can get your students to take this, you yourself can take this. But the idea is once you know your strength and your strengths, you take your top 5 and you try to find new ways to use those strengths in the next week, 5 new ways that you've never used them before. And then what is that going to do? Seligman took a look at people who are using this intervention. And he found that when people are using their signature strengths in new ways, that they have greater success than when they invest the same amount of time in remediating weaknesses. When they use their strengths, they feel ownership and authenticity because it's what they do well. They feel intrinsically motivated to use their strength. They learn more quickly because it's something they're good at. They feel invigorated rather than exhausted. They feel this feeling of inevitability. Hey, try to stop me. They feel a sense of excitement, like this is so cool. They feel a yearning to act in accordance with it. They create and pursue fundamental projects that revolve around this strength. And lastly, what happens when you've got this strength embedded in your mind and you know you're good at it, you always are on the lookout for new ways to use it. So that's the first one, guys. Get your learners to figure out what their signature strengths are and ask them to use it in new ways. I did this in a freshman writing class here in the UAE in a freshman composition with a group of wonderful Arab students. And I asked them to use their signature strength in their writing process. And it was an amazing process for all of us. And for me, it was an amazing time for me to learn from them. The second idea, I just talked to you about using your signature strengths. I'm going to talk to you about learners expressing gratitude and counting their blessings. And in this case, we want learners to focus on things that go right, savor the good things and people in our lives and not taking them for granted, taking in everyday beauty, and optimizing opportunities for happiness and connection. What I'm going to do here is give you the exact instructions for doing this, because I've done this with my learners myself. Ask your learners to write down up to 5 things for which they feel grateful. Remember, the physical record is important. It's not just in their heads, okay? Tell them it can be things that are rather small, like, hey, I caught my bus, or relatively large, like, wow, I passed this difficult class. The aim is to recall a positive event, experience, person, or thing, and then take pleasure in affirming emotions that accompany it, okay? Take pleasure in the fact that that happens. Now, here's some quick tips on this. Be specific, be deep, go for depth rather than breadth, get personal, try subtraction, which means think about what it would be like if you didn't have that. See good things as gifts, savor surprises, revise if the event is repeated. So if you've had the same thing happen again, think of another detail of that event. And then lastly, write these regularly, but don't overdo it because, with too much of a good thing, right? Okay, now I'm going to get to this next one, which is random acts of kindness. And this is my third activity for emotional self-regulation. And this is ask your learners to perform 5 acts of kindness in one day with various peers in your language class to promote kindness and happiness in themselves and others. For example, helping a classmate with a task without being asked. Saying thank you to the custodian who cleans the classroom. I want to tell you of an experience that I had with this. I was in charge of 5 young researchers in the University of Northern Iowa who were working with international students from the intensive English program. And what I had my tutors do was to take their international students and find a way to do random acts of kindness before their tutorial started. So for example, one pair of students wrote thank you notes and ran around the entire university and put these thank you notes on the cleaning carts of all of the custodians, thanking them for the cleanliness. And they actually gave them a candy bar as well. And when they came back to start their tutorial and get into the language part of it, they came back feeling so exhilarated and so positive that they started the language interaction on such a cool note that it was just an amazing event for both of them. And then after each act, have the learners write a description in a sentence or two. And this also will boost their happiness this further. And also, Tanya, yes, it also teaches them the values of kindness. Thank you. You wrote in caps, so I was able to see that. Okay, so now the last one that I'd like to present is finding silver linings. Okay, so what is this one all about? This is finding the bright side when things go wrong. And this is actually a primary component of optimism. And research links this optimism, this finding the silver lining, to lower depression, improved coping mechanisms, and greater satisfaction with the relationships you have with people. Now, forget the Pollyanna complex, right? I mean, Pollyanna is the lady that looks at the bright side too often, right? Many people have a tendency to look on the bright side too rarely, right? Not often enough. So this exercise is designed to help learners achieve a healthier balance. So every time, it's actually, for you psychology-oriented people, finding silver linings is actually cognitive reappraisal. So it's taking a look at an event, and instead of seeing what went wrong, it's what went right. So here it is. List 5 things that make your learners feel life is enjoyable and or worthwhile at this very moment. It can be as general as having good friends, or as specific as eating a piece of chocolate. Okay? Then have them think about a recent time when something didn't go their way. So what you're doing is you're priming them with positivity, okay? First, you're priming them with positivity. Then the second thing is to think about a recent time when something didn't go their way, or when they felt frustrated and upset. And then have them briefly describe this situation in writing or to tell a partner. Okay? So now, list 3 things that can help them see the bright side of this situation. For example, perhaps they missed their bus this morning. A few ways to look at the bright side might be, well, I got some good exercise running to catch it. Or how cool is it that I live in a city where buses run every 5 minutes, right? So there's always something, right? Just to show what a Pollyanna complex that I really have, because this is the last activity, and then I'll get questions, is my husband, I drive my husband absolutely nuts because my Pollyanna complex is so real that I can't really control it. A couple of years ago, there was a pretty bad earthquake in Chile, and we hadn't heard from our family in Chile, and we were very concerned. And so I put out an email message that if anyone hears from my family, please let me know via Facebook that everything's okay, because we couldn't get telephone contact. This was about 6 in the morning. So about 10 in the morning, I got a Facebook message from my brother-in-law that he had connected with everybody in the country, and everybody was fine. So I decided, okay, so I went and I made a cup of tea in the kitchen, that's actually coffee, and I sat down with my husband, I gave him a cup of coffee, and I sat down and I said, you know, Poppy, this earthquake is really a great thing. And my husband looked at me and said, what are you talking about? I said, well, you know what? There's a recession. Now with the earthquake, they're going to have to rebuild. There's not going to be any more unemployment. And my husband looked at me and he said, are you listening to yourself? Anyway, I guess there is a little bit of overdoing that with this. So I just wanted to end on a very positive note that we've gone over in this section. We've taken a look at citizenry through the UN goals. We've taken a look at intercultural competence and how to develop that through paraverbal and nonverbal exercises. And we've taken a look at issues of emotional self-regulation through 4 different activities, which are finding your signature strengths, what were they? Silver linings, gratitude, and random acts of kindness. Okay, so now I'm ready for questions. So I'm going to go over here to look for, where are my questions, guys? Do I have questions for Tammy? Do I have questions for Tammy over in my box?
Hi, Tammy. This is Ollie, the
Hey,
moderator. So there is a box set up which you should be able to see, Tammy, called Questions for
right.
Tammy. It's just underneath the orange stage lights
Okay,
there.
questions for Tammy. And, oh, ah, the activity shot are examples of that. Okay, wait. Question. Thank you for your great tips. My question is, how can we use self-regulation in our class to lead the students to have a positive change? Okay, well, you know what? I'm thinking that this question may have been asked when I was in the nonverbal part of it, because I'm hoping that the way that I dealt with the bottom part of the self-regulation with those other 4 activities might actually answer this question. Are examples of that? Okay. How can I apply this activity to young learners in classes? You know, especially, this is a fantastic idea. You know, whether it's young learners or learners with really low proficiency. I mean, the cool idea of when you look at the nonverbal ideas that I presented, the nonverbal part is so fun when you can do something with young learners or low proficient learners, because the nonverbal is something we can do without much language. We can use a lot of visuals. You can still have learners talk about things that they love, things that upset them. You can be in touch with me after the conference. I think that there's my contact information will be available. Oh, and I have one more thing, guys. I have one more thing. You can't go yet because this book was recently published. It's on the shelves only since last week. Sarah Mercer and I put this out, and it's actually not for your learners. It's actually for you. It's on teacher well-being, because sometimes we pay so much attention to learners that we don't pay attention to ourselves. And so this is taking the focus off of learner-centeredness and putting it on teacher-centeredness in a good way. So it takes a look at you and your health and your physical health, you and your mind, you and your motivation. And so if you have an opportunity, please go to Oxford University Press, take a look at this, and I would be thrilled if you were able to somehow find it. So, links to young learners. I can do that. I can do that with the production folks from L-Talk. I would be happy to do that. Okay. What connection is there between global skills and what is so-called global contexts? Okay, so I'm gonna speak from the very specific idea of what we're talking about in the global skills in this moment. I drew these global skills from what Oxford presented in this really cool paper. You do have access to it via a link that the production people will make available. This paper is really amazing. Oxford brought together 4 international experts on global skills and had them come together to write this paper. I took 3 of the components of those global skills. My 3 assigned to me were citizenry, intercultural competence, and emotional self-regulation. Global contexts, if I'm getting this right, I mean, because global context I think is a very broad idea. A global context is anywhere that there are people coming together in an intercultural way. So a global context is a place where more than one culture is part of the interaction. So Dubai, for example, which I live very near to, I'm 5 minutes from Dubai, is a very global context because it brings all of the cultures together into one place. I hope that makes sense. I think I was answering that question. And then, do I have any other questions here? Will it have the same effects if learners don't write good things that happen to them, but make podcasts or videos about them? I love that idea. This is from Racinta Sirangar. She said, what about podcasts and videos about them? I love that idea because another global skill is digital literacy. Woo-hoo, woo-hoo. And so if you can bring in podcasts and videos and discussion boards and anything else that brings in today's technology, you are making your learners 21st century learners, bringing in the global skill of digital literacy. You rock, Rosinta. If you hadn't come up with that, I would have come up with something as well. That was amazing. Oliver, I see that you're there, probably telling me to shut up and move on.
I would never tell a trainer to shut up, especially when the audience reaction has been so strong to your session. Thank you very much indeed, Tammy. I'm sure that everybody's going to give you